Do you know what empathy is? It's when you
spell it for me.
Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. My name is Jody Avirgan, and this is the first of a two-part podcast preview of Election Day, which is, you guys know when it is? It's tomorrow. Tomorrow's Election Day. We've got a ton planned over the next day and a half.
Actually, Jody, because of early voting.
It's been Election Day for like 3 weeks.
Early voting, which matters so much. Look, we've got a lot planned over the next day and a half or so before the results start rolling in, and I'll lay all of that out in a sec so you have it in your head, the guide to Election Day. But first, let's say hello to our usual Monday crew, who you've already heard from a little bit. Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver. Hello, Nate.
Hello, Jody.
I won't ask you how your weekend was because I know you spent it fighting with people on the internet. Hello.
That's a good weekend. That's a good weekend.
Good weekend for Nate. Senior politics writer Claire Malone. Hello.
Hi.
You probably spent your weekend doing normal human stuff.
I stress cooked. I made what did I do? I made beef bourguignon last night, and I made cannoli from scratch on Friday.
Did you make that bourguignon in a Instapot or old school?
Old school.
Le Creuset? Is that how you pronounce it?
I do not have Le Creuset or Le
Creuset.
Creuset. Just a regular old pot.
Uh-huh. And managing editor Micah Cohen is here. Hello, Micah.
I can hear the, fast forward 15-second button.
The food talk?
Jesus.
Wow.
Wait, isn't it at advanced 30 seconds now?
You can adjust it differently on different apps.
Oh, I see.
Good tip there. So look, I mentioned that today is part one of our preview. We're going to talk about some of the latest news and the biggest questions on all of our collective minds heading into tomorrow. Just to lay out the rest of the plan, tomorrow morning, we will post another podcast, part two, that's a bit more of a user's guide to election night. How to watch, when we expect stuff to come in, some hour-by-hour preview of the night itself. And then, I don't know, Micah, help me out here. What else is on the docket for tomorrow? We've got some plans.
All right, let me go from right now until tomorrow.
Okay, this is where people are going to hit the 15-second button.
We are going to publish final look at the governor's forecast, final look at the House forecast, final look at the Senate forecast. Then we'll have tomorrow a final housekeeping. Here's where the forecast ended. It'll freeze at about 10:30.
That's optimistic. I mean, our experience that polls trickle in until about 11 of election morning. If you're a pollster, get your out of there by 7 a.m.
Yeah, I don't like updating it on election day. But anyway,
at some point, the model will freeze.
There's also stray polls you don't know about because they're weird polls. I mean, there's like revenge of the weird pollsters. Some pollster in Canada
so we'll add those
decides
in.
That. We'll add them in.
Freeze the forecast.
Run 100,000 sims instead of 50,000 for our last update.
Which is exciting.
Freeze the forecast, and then
Live blog.
Then Live blog will launch at like 10 a.m. We'll go until every race is resolved.
Let's not ever promise.
Yeah, seriously.
It'll go until we know what's happening.
I thought that joke was obvious.
We have lots of folks coming in from out of town. There'll be lots of different angles on the live blog. We'll be doing some video stuff as well. Nate, you're going to be over at ABC, so folks can can be
ABC
your other screen.
ABC News. It's a pretty freaking cool set they have.
Yeah,
they do have a cool set.
So those are your screens: ABC on your TV and us on your laptop.
We will have the best election live blog on the internet.
Thank you for selling
That's
it.
a Micah Cohen guarantee.
No, I think we can non-arrogantly say that.
I just did.
I don't, for what it's worth. Okay, let's get into this show.
All right, who's going to be better, bro?
When we start calling Charlie,
we have a lot of people. We got some readers in there. We got good people. We got people that don't even write for us.
The question is not whether
good.
I think it's going to be better. The question is whether saying that is arrogant or not. That's the parameter.
It definitely is.
Okay. Well, that's okay. So you agree with me. All right, let's get into it. And I will ask a question that we've been asking basically at the top of every podcast, but will no longer, which is let's check in with our forecast. So I don't know, Micah.
Start with deluxe, by the way, because we got to get people used to the fact that we're going to make that the election night basis.
Yeah. All right, so starting with our deluxe model, which is what we're going to use on election night, that the key difference there is it factors in what the kind of expert handicappers think. We have Democrats with a 5 in 6 chance of taking the House, 84%. That is just where I don't like it.
We've debated this, right? We think that the worst is 80% exactly, because at 80%, you're still wrong kind of a lot, wrong, quote unquote. But people tend to round that up, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're at, say, 92%, okay, at that point, people maybe understandably treat that as almost certain, but you're only going to be wrong a third as often as at 80%. So I was rooting for this thing to go north or south
Right.
of 80. Yeah, it's a little north of 80.
Yeah,
Although,
so I
the
asked
light
this-
forecast, which is the polls only forecast, is exactly 80.0%.
That's crazy. 4 and 5. Yeah.
So Mike, I asked this a couple weeks ago, but it is worth asking, at what point does it kind of push out of that discomfort zone and say, like, you know what, we feel pretty confident saying this is
I think it's
for
like
real.
I think it's like
90.
hot, upper 80s, 90.
Right,
yeah.
okay. So it's still in that discomfort zone. Okay.
But to give people the range, our 80% confidence interval is Democrats pick up 19 seats to 53 seats. So if Democrats pick up 20 seats and don't win the House, I don't want to hear any shit about how our forecast was wrong.
Well, no, sir, because this is the 80% range, right? We're even saying we're going to give you 1 out of 5 times
Right.
to criticize
It'll be
us, right?
outside that.
Now, if Democrats only win 13 seats,
Criticize.
well, no. Criticize the polls.
No, criticize us.
No, criticize the polls. Or unless you thought, here's my rule. If you want to criticize us, you have to today on Twitter tell us what your forecast is. Give us your 80 percentile range.
Okay. So, listeners, that's your charge. Let's keep moving through here. Do you have anything else you want to point out? Can we contextualize this number? What are things that happen 1 out of 6 times?
It's Russian roulette.
Russian
right?
roulette.
In general,
Rolling a 6 on a 6-sided die.
Okay. So
That's 1 out of 6. It's a good way to define it.
I'm just trying to give people a metaphor here. Is that the best metaphor? It's like, would you play Russian roulette and feel pretty confident?
You wouldn't.
You wouldn't. So let's talk about the Senate. Claire, where does the Senate forecast stand?
right now we're giving Republicans a 6 in 7 chance of holding on to the Senate, and that's using our deluxe model numbers. Get used to the deluxe model.
We're hawking deluxe these
That's
days.
DELUXE deluxe. And then, so for the range of seats that could gain on either side, Republicans gaining 4 seats and Democrats gaining 2 is kind of the meaty
part of the
meaty
bell
part
curve.
of the curve.
Nate, you wrote a piece last week that said it would take a systemic polling error for Democrats to win the Senate or Republicans to win the House. Elaborate on that. How far would polls have to be off by for that to be the case?
So if polls were off by as much as they were in 2016, which is 2 or 3 points of a national systematic error, then both chambers have become close and interesting. That would be a scenario in the House where we're kind of watching the West Coast and seeing how that comes in. We're maybe waiting for mail ballots to be returned in California. You might even get into a territory where there are recounts. There'll be a lot of second guessing if Democrats win by 3 seats or lose by 2 seats, kind of how they perform in individual districts. That's different, though, than 2016, where, our forecast the day of gave Trump not quite a 1 in 3 chance, but 30%, 29%. So it's kind of saying if there's this polling error, then he's going to win the Electoral College, right? This time we're saying there are a lot of times when it goes to overtime, Republicans beat their polls by a couple points, they go to overtime, and then they lose anyway in overtime. Because the Democratic map is pretty robust. There seems to be, I'm not going to use the term momentum because our model just kind of updates itself, but like it has ticked a little bit further toward Democrats in the last...
The big mo.
It's not much. It's right on the fringe where everything's on the fringe this year between, it's like right on the fringe between saying, oh, yeah, there's a swing toward Democrats and between saying, oh, it's flat, but it's like a little, you feel better about your position if you're Democrats than you did probably 48 hours ago. But like this, you don't feel better if you're a Republican in the House.
Do these forecasts match your guys' gut sense of the race?
I have a very strong gut sense, which I'm not going to reveal about the House.
I might ask you to reveal it later.
There are some places on the Senate map where I am curious to see the results tomorrow because
It doesn't match.
I'm curious to see what candidates can almost, outlive partisanship. And in some places, I'm interested to see if what we're seeing from public polling is correct.
So you think Indiana, you're like, I'm not sure I trust that. Missouri, yeah.
Yeah. Even Montana. There was, I saw something on Twitter this weekend where, as far as turnout in Texas, early voting had already surpassed the total turnout of 2014. And I was like, that's interesting. I know all the cautions about early voting, but there's just some stuff where I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what's going on here.
If we're just going by pure gut, I kind of think Beto is going to come really close in Texas.
Oh my God.
And or win.
So
I'm taking a stand, people.
I appreciate that, and that's a great tease because I think we'll circle back at the end of this conversation to some of these gut feelings, predictions, big questions, etc. But let's continue to check off some of the basic inputs and what we're seeing in the model itself. Can I ask a question about the generic ballots? It currently stands with Democrats an 8-point lead. Mike, I'm curious what you make of that, and then more importantly, maybe how this compares to past midterms.
So 8 points is a big lead on the generic ballot. There are really two ways to answer this question. The first is what I think is the correct way and the kind of most simplistic way, which is to say 8 points is a big lead for Democrats on the generic ballot. Historically, it is consistent with the national environment we have seen in other wave years. So, for example, 2010 was a wave year for Republicans. The generic ballot was about 9 or 10 points in their favor, according to, I think we're using a Real Clear Politics average here. 2006 was a wave year for Democrats. The generic ballot was like 11 or 12 points in their favor. The eventual result...
It overshot them by
a couple points.
Yeah, but look, usually the waves that we remember, 2006, 1994, 2010, the out party, not the president's party, won the popular vote by, 6 or 7 or 8 points. And so Democrats are poised to be near that or a little above it. I mean, I know this is like really, really, really picking thin hairs, but like, that's not the metaphor. But like, it's 8
picking thin hairs.
Nits.
It's 8.4 points, not 8. And I know I don't really want to make a big deal about that, but like you do get, 9 is pretty different than 8, and 8 is pretty different than 7, which is pretty different than 6, right? So, these little ticks between 8 and 8.5 is kind of the range it will vary between, it seems. So it's not a big deal. It doesn't change kind of fundamentally how you would describe the election. But again, we think the break-even point at which Republicans can be even money to hold the House is if that gets down to about 6. In fact, our different models differ on that. But let's say 5.5, 6, 6.5, 7, somewhere in that range, right? So, if it's 8.5 and the standard deviation worth of polling error is 2.5 points, and you get back down to 6, that's kind of one reason why you can say that if there's this normal-sized polling error and it works in the GOP's favor, because half the time it's going to work in Democrats' favor instead, right? Then you're in an environment where it's very competitive.
But that's why I say there's two ways to answer this. Is to me, the simple way is just like, hey, that's a really big lead. It's consistent with past waves. The more complicated way, and probably if you're interested in how many seats change hands, is Nate's way, which is because of GOP structural advantages, 8 points, 8.5 points actually isn't that far above the threshold that Democrats need. But you know how I've been playing around with this like narrative calculator, how to calculate the narrative depending on all the results. I've come to believe that.
What does that mean?
So that like on Wednesday, we're all going to wake up and
hopefully,
let's say Republicans gain 2 seats in the Senate, Democrats win 33 seats in the House and the majority, and Democrats pick up a bunch of governorships.
How will the media cover it?
Yeah, what's the
and you're trying to devise a formula or forecast for
exactly. So I'm trying to devise like a really simple way to just like combine all those things into how good of a night it was for Democrats or Republicans. And I think I've come to believe that a lot of weight should go to the National House popular vote, which isn't a perfect measure of the political will of the American people, but is a better measure than anything else.
In recent years, the House popular vote has been a good measure. It didn't necessarily used to be because you had parties that were very different, where Democrats in Congress would win a lot of seats in the South and therefore win the House, but it was kind of a quasi three-party system.
Okay, let's take a break here, and we will loop back to some of this stuff, and mostly we just want to give Mike a little more time to develop this theory.
It's like, no joke, I have like a spreadsheet that I can
Okay, we'll see. By the end of the show, maybe it will have improved just by a little bit. But let's take a break now, and up next, we're going to talk about the way that Trump is campaigning by stoking fears about immigration in these final weeks and whether we think it will be effective. But first, let me tell you that today's podcast is brought to you by WeWork. When WeWork was founded back in 2010, the primary focus was to provide freelancers and entrepreneurs with an environment that allowed them to engage with and benefit from a network of like-minded businesses, all in a setting that encouraged innovation and collaboration. Well, now WeWork provides a range of solutions for medium, large, and enterprise businesses as well, such as private office space for up to 200 people or full-floor custom build-outs. These include enhanced security, privacy, and the ability to express your brand identity while at the same time maintaining the innovative design, flexibility, and the high level of service that companies have come to expect from WeWork. WeWork is designing, building, and operating environments that empower your people, your employees, to do their best work. That is, of course, the goal of everything. And when your people are at their best, your business is as well. Visit WeWork.com right now to find a location near you. Once again, visit today, WeWork.com. Today's podcast is also brought to you by Bixler Jewelry. Bixler has partnered with hundreds of enterprises to create officially licensed fine jewelry collections featuring handcrafted designs and custom-made styles to capture the essence of your favorite sports team, television shows, films, and so much more. With offbeat designs and over 230 years of rich history, they pride themselves on handcrafting that fine jewelry. Let's look at the Valor Collection. It includes custom engraved rings, bracelets, and necklaces for U.S. Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, Purple Heart Foundation, soldiers, and veterans, and there are many, many more collections. You can see them all right now at Bixlers.com, and you can get 20% off your first purchase. Just go to Bixlers.com, enter the promo code 538, that's BIXLERS.com, and the promo code 538, the numbers, not the letters. Once again, Bixlers.com. All right, we're back, and last week Trump said he would deploy as many as 15,000 military personnel to the Mexican border in response to the caravans of Central American immigrants heading to the United States to seek asylum. That's more than double what the Pentagon said it would be sending. Immigration and crime have also been the focus of Trump's tweets and campaign rallies. He, without merit, said that there were Middle Easterners in the caravan. He raised the prospect of trying to end birthright citizenship, which he most likely can't do. And he promoted a racist ad that plays into fears about immigrants and crime. So let's talk about this strategy. And Claire, I guess at the risk of asking the obvious, why is Trump going back to this playbook in the final weeks?
Because immigration is a really motivating issue for Republicans. If you're a Republican and you're feeling pretty good about the economy, which isn't wrong, the economy's doing pretty well right now, and you see, as actually, frankly, I think a lot of people in the country see immigration as the number one issue in the news in some ways, the most divisive issue. I think it speaks to the Republican Party's increasing reliance on this twinning of identity and sometimes economics or sometimes law and order, the idea that the other, the immigrant, is a threat to your job, a threat to your safety. That's a reason why Trump is going back to that playbook. And it is something that incites Republicans, and certainly I would say incites responses from Democrats as well. So I think there's some risk that Trump has in playing this up to the extent that he is in these last couple of weeks.
There's also potential benefit, though, right?
Well, yeah.
For Republicans.
It's both. I think there's a risk that it backfires and it motivates a lot of Democrats. And yes, there's also the fact that it's a motivating issue for Republicans. That's what I was saying.
Yeah. So this book just came out that we all were talking about, Identity Crisis. I think Claire mentioned it on the podcast.
Yeah,
actually.
And if you're in Brooklyn tonight, I am actually doing a talk with John Sides about the book at the Brooklyn Historical Society at 6:30.
Check that out. But anyway, in that book, they talk about how non-college educated white voters before Obama were not good at describing where the parties fell on issues of race. In other words, if you ask them, like, which party favors more resources to minority communities, they were not good at placing Democrats to the left of Republicans. That changed under Obama and then was heightened when Trump ran. And so I wonder if part of what I'm curious about is, does Trump emphasizing immigration in these final days have the effect of putting those voters back into that racialized frame of mind that they were in 2016? These are the Obama-Trump voters, right? Where I think there are a lot of voters, if their issue at the top of their mind is health care, they're going to vote Democratic. Think of like the Kansas gubernatorial race, right? If the issue is immigration, maybe not. And so I don't know. Because I work for 538, my sort of instinct is always to play down sort of like campaign strategy and final week movement and stuff. But I kind of do think in looking at the polls, I think Nate wrote this piece that found that actually the what we're seeing has more in common with the 2012 map than the 2016 map. I wonder if all this will have the effect of moving things a little closer to that 2016 map.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up about this Sides book and this notion of identity that you brought up? Because does it mean that this appeal that Trump is making in this last week, we can talk about how effective we think it will be. Are you saying it's worth thinking less of that less as an appeal towards immigration or immigration policy and more towards white identity? I mean, should we change our language a little bit?
That's the argument of the book.
Yeah.
Is that, and reading the book and I guess internalizing the thesis, it jives with a lot of like the reporting I did during the primary season. And historically, the idea that going back to the idea that people see their white identity and their jobs being threatened by people coming into the country and their welfare being threatened by people coming into the country. If we're talking about wide sweeps of American history, it very much reminds me of the working class white communities' responses in the mid-century. I'm thinking like, Irish and Italian people living in urban areas. And there was the Great Migration from the South where a lot of black people came up and wanted to get jobs in urban areas. And, these white ethnic groups felt that their livelihoods were being threatened by blacks coming into the big cities from the South. And so it's not a very new idea in American history. It's just that now Trump is sort of, I guess, consolidating white identity around, Middle Easterners or around Central American or Mexican immigrants, in the popular imagination. I do want to, I don't know if this is okay for me to talk about right now in the conversation, but I mean, if we're talking about Democrats, the party has gotten a lot more liberal on immigration since, we've said this before on this podcast, if Obama's, 2006 stance on immigration were his stance in the 2018 Democratic Party, he'd be considered conservative within it. And I wrote a piece in September about some of these policy shifts in the Democratic Party. And I'm going to read a quote from Cecilia Munoz that she said in an interview in Slate. She said, "I think that we need to be willing to address how do we think immigration enforcement should be conducted? What's a way to do that actually values people's lives and civil rights? The abolish ICE argument doesn't touch on those questions, and I think that's a mistake." She's, I should mention, a former Obama administration official. And I do think that there are people who are strategists within the Democratic Party who are thinking about, well, the most visible part of our immigration policy is this abolish ICE, this a little bit more pulling at the heartstrings kind of thing of we need to let asylum seekers in, we need to, that kind of thing. But I do think that in the popular Democratic imagination, a lot of their base lacks a concrete idea of what does an immigration policy look like. And I do think that that's probably going to be something that they need to figure out in the next 2 years as they put forth a nominee for president.
Totally agree. And remember, Claire, when we did the Political Ads podcast, and immigration was one of Republicans' top things they were running ads on, and it was Democrats were hardly running any ads about immigration. So there's like the messaging is only going one way. I just don't know what if the campaign has been about health care up until a week or two ago, let's say. I don't know what power Trump has to change what the campaign is about versus just what the media is talking about.
Nate, how do we go about answering that question?
I disagree with your guys' takes. We
What
have
are
a
our
model.
takes? Wait,
what are our
takes?
takes?
No, I think
I don't think either of us had a take.
Yeah.
I think Trump is closing on immigration because he doesn't like immigrants and because he can tell himself a story where that's why he won in 2016, which is different than it necessarily being a well-thought-out strategy. If you listen to what House Republicans are saying, who they're complaining to in the kind of pre-mortems to Politico or whatever else, right? They're like, this is not the closing message that we wanted. We are having very good economic data. We would like to close on the economy. We were happy with Kavanaugh. We would like to close on the economy in Kavanaugh, right? We do not think immigration, especially the issues that the way Trump is addressing immigration, is the way to go necessarily. And in our forecast, the GOP position has not improved. Trump's approval rating is down from 43 to 42. Not a big deal, but it's not getting better.
So I think we all tend to agree, have an understanding of why Trump is doing this. I think it's relatively obvious. But Nate, a little more on whether it's smart strategy and the evidence in one direction or the other. Is there anything we can look at kind of state by state or district by district level and say that, particularly close districts are particularly vulnerable to appeals to white nationalism? Or does that track in a way that maybe it tracked in 2016?
Maybe. I just think that dialogue is oversimplified. Look, one question is how are Democrats doing in the Sun Belt? The wave, to the extent you want to call it a wave, was pretty clear early on in the Midwest and the Northeast. Democrats were always going to win a bunch of seats in Pennsylvania, do well in Michigan, for example. What you've seen lately is that the polls have gotten a little bit scary for Republicans in Georgia. There aren't a lot of swing districts in Texas, but a couple of them there are. Sessions is down now, for example, in the most recent Upshot poll. I'm not a huge fan of early voting data, but that looks pretty strong for Democrats in Nevada.
Nevada's the
exception,
yeah.
Right? Florida was a state. Florida was a state where you had Democrats underperforming a lot of polls. Now, now Shalala seems to be up by some semi-comfortable margin. California, we haven't had a lot of polling, but it's another state where, so it's kind of like, look, parties usually have a good year in the midterm when the other party is president, and they reclaim a lot of territory, right? So in some ways, if Democrats have a good night, then they would get the best of both worlds, both the kind of suburban Atlanta and the old school Obama, Iowa college town or Iowa wealthy suburb district or whatever else, and even a few working class places like up in Maine or whatever, right? And so, in some ways, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that polls have Democrats ahead by 8 or 9 points in the popular vote, right? Obama won by 7 points in 2008. Mm-hmm. So let's not lose sight of the fact that when one party is winning the popular vote by 8 or 9 points, then it's going to look like a very blue map in a lot of different places. I'm not sure. I guess probably Trump would rather play the 2016 map than 2012. Obviously, that was a better map for the GOP in the Electoral College. It's maybe different in terms of districts. They're both actually not great maps for Democrats in a neutral environment, but it's set up in a way where, again, if you get up to an 8 or 9 point threshold, then a lot of things that were thought to be safe, right, begin to fall. And especially when you have a lot of Democratic money, which we haven't talked about, you have strong, quote unquote, candidates. And so I don't know. You could argue it's better to save the Senate where you have a more finite number of races. Well, even then, Claire McCaskill actually looks a little bit better in the polls she did maybe a week or two ago. But, if you argue that if you told me the GOP launched a plan 2 weeks ago to save the Senate or, in fact, entrench their Senate majority and sacrifice the House, no one's written that, I don't think, but that would kind of be a coherent plan and almost like kind of how they
stumbled into that.
It's sort of how they're behaving. But what I don't know is one of our writers, Jeffrey Skelly, wrote this piece where he used the City Lab typology for districts, which breaks all the 435 congressional districts down into pure urban, pure rural, rural suburban, urban suburban, dense suburban, sparse suburban. And what he showed is that, and this was at the end of October, 41% of Democratic pickups, forecasted Democratic pickups, according to our model, were taking place in sparse suburban districts. And so what I wonder about is those districts are probably whiter and less college educated than the country overall, and therefore does this type of are those type of districts closer to what the Senate battleground is like, or closer to what the overall House battleground is like? I don't know. Maybe I'm in the minority here, but I guess I do think that the more Trump can racialize the election, the better chance Republicans have of keeping the House and definitely the Senate.
I think that's one of the big questions: is what is going to be more effective, a big Democratic turnout or an energized
Democrats are gonna turn out.
An energized Republican base that's into Trump's past couple of messages. One about Kavanaugh. So if we go to the other dimension of, if we're going to use the Identity Crisis book as our framework for this conversation, he talks a bit about how Hillary Clinton's appeal to gender identity did not work, yeah. And so, if Trump is kind of, maybe his game book was with Kavanaugh, it was a little bit of gender identity, right? Male gender identity with Kavanaugh. And now with these last couple of appeals, it's racial identity, it's white identity.
I wonder if we're going to look back at 2018 and say that, gender was activated in a way that we thought it would be with the possibility of the first woman president. And as the Identity Crisis book lays out, it just was never really activated in the way that black voters were activated when Obama first ran, right? But I think we're going to look back at 2018 and see that gender did play that role this year. So to me, it's what can Republicans do to goose their turnout? And I think, at least, based on the best evidence we have, that Trump has a better sense of his party than Paul Ryan does. The polls show people are not, as good as the economy is, people are not thinking about it, not rating it as a high issue. And we've seen time and time again that issues of gender, issues of culture motivate the Republican base.
So let's talk about the flip side of that motivation, though. Claire, you brought it up a little bit ago, which is there a chance that Trump's appeal to this nationalism, to this racial identity will end up motivating Democrats and maybe more than it ends up motivating the Republican base? Counter motivation?
Well, that's what I was saying, is that we don't know.
Yeah.
That's the big question. Is
how do you go about thinking that through? Or we just wait and see?
We wait and see.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, because I said this jokingly, but I really do mean it. I don't have anything left to say in some ways about the race for United States Senate. Like, some of this is we have to see what has stuck on Election Day and what in the past 2 years people have digested and how that spits itself out either end on on Election Day.
Nice.
To have a gross metaphor.
But Nate, reading into what you were saying, I guess you do think there's the risk of it could turn off more voters than it turns on?
I think the GOP has an issue where they now think that like turning out their base is synonymous with good electoral strategy, right? And roughly speaking, I think you have three things that are probably about equally important in a House election: turning out your base, suppressing, if you will, or not turning out the opponent's base, and then swing voters. And I think the GOP thinks about that one thing a lot more than the other two. And
but aren't the other two, this is not based on data, this is just me being a pundit, the other two feel baked into me at this point?
I think it's a bad argument. And I think the reason why it's a bad argument is then we're seeing this actually, you could argue, if you want to look at the fact that maybe Democrats are like a little bit upticking in these upshot polls, for example, right? Midterm turnout is less than half of eligible voters, right? We think it's going to be around 45%, could get up to 50, which would be enormous, right? Would be unprecedented if it got up to 48 or 50, right? It's still 48 or 50 or 45 or whatever. There are still substantial groups of Democrats that aren't likely to turn out. And so if you begin to activate the Hispanic vote, if you begin to activate the youth vote and the black vote from very low levels to medium low, that's actually pretty bad for the GOP. You know, we sit here and we have a show about elections, basically, and we cover elections and other things. And like, you know, there are lots of people who are out there and like they may have strong things about Trump, but they're fairly indifferent toward the midterm, things that get them engaged and involve storylines. You know, we're not anywhere near the upper bound on how engaged Democrats can be when you have 45% turnout.
Right. That makes sense.
One last thing here, and then we'll move on to talk about some of our big questions. Claire, I know you said you didn't have more things to say about this election, but you did write about what states Trump is visiting. Is there anything to read into that? Is it smart strategy? And then I guess also in a larger sense, you know, how much of a role does a president play in a midterm election like this? Can a president really move the needle?
Yeah, last week, Trump's public schedule was released, and he has trips planned to Florida 2 times, Missouri 2 times, Indiana 2 times, West Virginia, Montana, Georgia, Tennessee, and Ohio. So busy week. And I think the general agreement is that this is an indication that Trump has mostly conceded the House. Perhaps we could have seen that with his little spat with Paul Ryan last week, where he seemed to be gearing up to kind of blame things on other people for losing the House. But, you know, I think it's mostly smart strategy. The one thing I thought was interesting is that Trump is not going to a couple of states where, in this last week, where they're really close and that maybe, you know, he could bump them over the edge, and that would be Nevada and Arizona. And I think in part it's because Trump doesn't want to be associated with a potential loss. And in somewhere like Arizona, where Kyrsten Sinema has been up in a lot of recent polls, that probably makes him a little bit nervous. He's going to places like Georgia and Ohio because they have very high profile, very close gubernatorial contests. So I think in general, Trump has a smart schedule. I mean, Florida twice, Missouri twice, Indiana twice. Those are 3 states with, I would argue, Missouri and Indiana are more dire for both parties to kind of, or the Republicans to really take those seats from Democrats. I tend to think Florida will be a little bit more, you know, my gut, Claire Malone's gut, not 538's Deluxe Model's gut, sort of thinks that Florida will swing towards the Democrats. But yeah, I think Trump has a pretty good, you know, sensible pre-election travel schedule.
Didn't it seem too Senate focused?
Too Senate focused?
Wouldn't he want to?
What do you mean? The average Senate battleground is an R plus 16 and 538. It's 16 points more Republican than the country overall.
Yeah.
The average House battleground is like an R plus 8. Okay, that's the difference between a place where Trump is above water and slightly underwater. So, you know, not a bad heuristic that like you're at best going to be break-even approval in most of the competitive House districts, maybe a blot where you're 0.2 or 3 or 4 underwater, right? In the Senate, you can go to Montana or Indiana and places where net favorable, actually, right? And so maybe the Trump factor is part of why we've seen the split between the Senate and the House.
But your point is, if it may not be Trump saying, I don't give a shit about the House, I want to focus on the Senate. It may just be, hey, I'm going to go where I'm popular, and that might be.
I mean, if you're going to have him out there at all, then it's not a terrible strategy to have him. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, yeah, the one state that's on there that's just kind of like, I'm popular is West Virginia. Because I don't think his pollsters are like, oh, yeah, Morrissey's really going to pull it out over Manchin. I think that's just kind of like it has a Senate race. Trump is very popular in West Virginia. He just kind of wants to. It's a place for him to go and feel.
All right, let's end this segment, and we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we will get to lay out some of our biggest questions that we have going into tomorrow, Election Day, and we can either discuss them or just lay them out there for you, listener. But first, let me tell you that today's podcast is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. Hiring is challenging, but there is one place you can go where hiring is simple, fast, and smart, a place where growing businesses connect to qualified candidates. That place, ZipRecruiter.com/538. ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job boards, but they don't stop there. With their powerful matching technology, ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience. It goes out there and invites them to apply to your job. That is the recruiter part of ZipRecruiter. And then, as applications come in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one and spotlights the top candidates so you never miss a great match. ZipRecruiter is so effective that 80% of employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day. Think about that. You post, one day later, you have a quality candidate sitting there in your inbox. With results like that, it's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is the highest rated hiring site in America. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/538. That's ZipRecruiter.com/538. One more time, ZipRecruiter.com/538. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. All right, we're back tomorrow. It's Election Day. We're going to be live blogging all day, as we said. We're going to finally be getting some answers to the questions we've been asking for the past 2 years. Let's lay out some of those big questions that we are eager to see answered, and then, we'll be able to follow up on them, obviously, after the election is over as well. Nate, what's your big question heading into tomorrow?
So my big question is who's going to win?
Okay, yes, you've answered that 2 years running now.
It's like, does the macro or the micro prevail, I guess? How localized are these results, right? Are we going to get a map where it's like, okay, the GOP had a really bad night, but somehow Barbara Comstock held on, right? Or is it super like polar and wavy where it's very, very, very highly correlated? That's interesting to me.
Do you have a hunch either way?
Are we talking about overall hunches?
Sure.
Okay, let me say a couple of things. Number one, I think people in politics and in media are always fighting the last war. Number 1B, I think people misunderstood a lot of things about 2016, including what the polls said and forecasting and so forth, right? So if I knew nothing else about the election, then I would tend to think that people tended to hedge more toward Republicans. So being a little bit of a contrarian, then I would think that maybe maybe that would be Democrats overperforming relative to expectations. Though it's so hard to pin down expectations, I don't even know exactly, right? The expectation certainly is that Democrats will win the House.
But it's like 30 seats, not 40 seats.
I mean, in these it's not just us, right? There is, unlike in some past years, there's like very good consensus among these different forecasts, right? And this kind of range of 30 to 40 is like 30 to 40 is like the fat part of our range, where there's kind of like a flat top if you look at the chart, where like it's the most likely modal outcome, That's become kind of a consensus range. Mm-hmm. Sometimes consensus is a little bit dangerous, but among people who are in one way or another, whether they're conducting polls like the Upshot, whether they're rating races like Hook Political, whether they have a model like ours, that range, people who are looking at the races in a granular way, right, that's the modal part of the range. I think that if you have an outcome where Democrats win 41 seats on Tuesday night, people would be more surprised by that than they should be. I think if they win 20 seats, then people would be maybe a little bit more surprised than they should be also. But I do think that people don't realize that the reason why we give Democrats, our model gives Democrats an 85-ish% chance is not because there's not uncertainty. There's a ton of uncertainty, but because the polling is pretty bad for Republicans. It's very bad, I'd say, for Republicans, right? I mean, you're getting pretty deep into districts that would be like the 40th or the 50th district that Democrats would need, where where the polling is a toss-up for Republicans. And the actual tipping point districts, they're tending to lose those in the polls. And they're trying to win all these races against moderate odds, not against steep odds, but moderate odds in environments where Democrats are outspending them 2-1 in the final week of the campaign. Parties almost always have a good midterm when the other party is president. Trump is unpopular. We can debate how unpopular he is. To me, there's like an obviousness about the fact that, we were just expecting Democrats to do a little bit better than expected, a little bit better when usually the average seat gain is like 28 or 30 seats in the president's first term, right? We're saying 35. We're saying just based on everything we see, it's going to do a little bit better than average. And I feel like people are reluctant to brace the non-controversialness of that sentiment,
Just because I enjoy doing this, I know it makes you squirm a little bit to try and tease out this hunch of yours. 63 seats. That's what Republicans picked up in 2010. Would a result for Democrats like that, given the hunch you just laid out, surprise you?
63 would be a lot, right? And, it is a polar country, and so there is some limit. I mean, this is why I think the deluxe version of our model is a good hedge between the pure algorithm and looking at what other people say. Like, definitely like the Cook groups at all are skeptical beyond a certain point. They would say, yeah, there are all these lean R districts which are not safe, but you get to the likely threshold, yeah, maybe Democrats will win a couple of those, but not too likely, right? So, that goes up to 53. If I were placing bets, and again, our median is 35 in deluxe, and our mode is 33 or something, right? But like, if I were placing bets on the roulette wheel, the numbers that I think are underrated relative to what the average person would say, it's not way out in the 50s. That's in the 50s, that's genuinely unlikely enough, right? But I think like the 40s is where I think it's underweighted a little bit, because it's not that far from the 30s where the range is concentrated.
All right, Claire, you got you want to come back to some of the big questions you have for tomorrow?
Yeah, so I think I already put one of them out there, but a second one I have is just about some of the interesting turnout model propositions that Georgia and Florida are working with in their governor's races. So these are, on the Democratic side, is what I'm talking about, the two black candidates who are, making the appeal and saying we can turn out voters, black voters, in higher numbers. They didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton in the levels that she needed in 2016. We can turn them out. But you know what? This, I think, has been an undersold part of the equation. Part of their proposition is I can win over the, those middle voters as well. It's not purely a turn out the base strategy. So I'm really interested to see those races and how they turn out tomorrow. Now, I think the Georgia one is freighted with a lot of different stuff. We might see a runoff in Georgia, and I believe the runoff election would then be on December 4th or something.
I think that's
something
right,
like that. So Georgia could
be on our mind for quite a while.
Anyway, but no, I really think that those two races are just incredibly interesting. I mean, Andrew Gillum was a surprise win to us during the primaries, and I think those two states are going to be the ones that I am personally most interested in because of what they might say about new propositions for Democrats winning. And it's the South. I think that shouldn't be overlooked. That's a very different model than I think a lot of Southern Democrats are used to running.
Yeah, I agree with that. Also, Georgia, Florida, and I'd probably throw Wisconsin in there. Even though most of the attention is on the House and Senate, I think Georgia, Florida, Wisconsin gubernatorial races are going to have, you can argue about whether they should or not, but I think they will have an outsized influence on what the narrative coming out of the election is, and in particular, sort of how people describe where the Democratic Party is going into the 2020 primary.
We've spent a fair amount of time on this podcast talking about some of the core fundamentals of political science. And I just wonder, Nate, do you feel like any of those are up for grabs this election in any way more than in other elections? I mean, are we poised to learn something big about incumbency advantage or the role of the president in midterms or early voting or any of these kind of things that we've tended
incumbency
to think of?
was my big question.
Was one of your big questions?
Yeah, incumbency is, this is a big force that I always say people aren't talking about enough, and we don't maybe talk about enough, but incumbency is not as powerful as it used to be. And so therefore, one of the things we didn't know at the start of the year was, let's say you're a Republican in a GOP plus 8 district, where it's 8 points more Republican. Let's say Trump won it by 8 points to simplify, right? But you're an incumbent, and the national environment in an open district is Democrat plus 8. Ordinarily, you would think, okay, it's a 8-point GOP district, it's an 8-point Democratic tied, but you're an incumbent, and so therefore you're still a pretty clear favorite. That's not what those districts are looking like in the polling this year. Those are looking like they're toss-ups, and that's a big deal, right? And so the fact that, like, there is a price to be paid for the fact that party line voting occurs so strenuously, that parties are so parliamentary, that, you know, I mean, the Carlos Curbellos or Will Hurds of the world, the GOP incumbents, and they're both potentially in a little bit of trouble, right? But the ones who, you know, the mere handful of them who truly defy the party may be doing fine in the kind of Clinton districts, but you don't get a pass anymore because you're, quote unquote, a good fit for your district as often anymore. Some do, many don't. Same for Democrats in the Senate, where Joe Manchin seems like he can pull it off. Tester seems like he can pull it off. And you go down in order, right? Donnelly, maybe McCaskill. Yeah. But that's Heidkamp, although she does seem like a good fit for North Dakota. That state's really red, and she hasn't run a good campaign.
Yeah, I think kind of what's left of the incumbency advantage as partisanship has increased is one of the big questions and one of the main factors that explains the difference between the Senate and the House.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote about this last week. I think one of the X factors that, you know, the model can't really account for is how much does gender play into this. Like, yeah. I don't think it does not surprise me that the two Democratic incumbents at red states that are struggling the most, particularly post-Kavanaugh vote, are Claire McCaskill of Missouri and Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota. And it is because people perceive women as being more liberal, which is not the position that you want to be in as a red state Democratic woman. And I think that those two women have had to do a lot more to prove otherwise. That, you know, this goes back to the gender identity thing, right? Do you identify more with your gender and the struggles of your gender, or are you going to, you know, work for all of us and compromise with Trump? I think that is the uncomfortable position that those two women have been put in, and I think it is no surprise that they're the ones who are struggling the most.
Can I throw out some other things that I'll be particularly curious about? What does turnout and what does the partisan breakdown look like among white women without a college degree? Is it like closer to 50-50 or is it closer to like, you know, 65-35? That's a group that like Democrats, there's a path you could see them making headway with that group, but I don't know if they will. But as opposed to like non-college educated white men, feels like a really tough group for Democrats, where maybe they can make a little more inroads with non-college educated white women. The other thing I am particularly interested in is, and it's related, is just like the Midwest. You know, we've written a lot about this, but the polls suggest the Midwest will swing back a little bit towards Democrats. If that's reversion to the mean, if that's something else, whatever it is, that's like really important for 2020 because the Midwest has a boatload of electoral college votes.
And it's why the Scott Walker race in Wisconsin is so interesting.
Totally. That race, it's so weird. That race has like, you would think that would be like a headlining race.
It's not getting much
but
attention.
It doesn't
it's
get
sort of bizarre
attention.
For where it is and how high profile of a person he is.
I feel like it is. I kind of get it, though, because at least in the gubernatorial category, Florida and Georgia just are such interesting races that they suck up all the, I would call it like assigning oxygen in the room.
Yeah.
And, you know, Wisconsin is still really important, but I do think we still news desk assign based on what's the most exciting for people to cover. And Wisconsin feels a little bit more, it's interesting, but in a dry way. Like, I understand why it hasn't been.
Yeah. No,
also,
that's
Walker's
fair.
had his like
apologies to all our Wisconsin.
Times.
Sorry, Galen.
Sorry, Galen.
On
and
Galen's birthday of all days to run down Wisconsin.
All right, let's wrap up here. And I've learned many times to not ask for anything resembling a prediction from this crew. But let me end with this question: will we, at the end of tomorrow night, go to bed with anything resembling a firm understanding of how this election shook out?
Yes, that's my prediction.
We'll know at the end of the night, or you just never plan to go to bed.
All right, let me make a point that's maybe going to be too subtle, right?
Maybe.
We think there's a 15% chance that Republicans win the House. That doesn't mean there's only a 15% chance that like it's close, right? It's probably roughly double that. It's probably a 30 or 35% chance that it's close. And the same in the Senate, right? I mean, you do have to drive the ball down a pretty narrow fairway for neither one to be a sweat, right? And so therefore I would say the odds are probably a little higher than 50-50 that there is some stress on one of those two branches tomorrow night.
All right. Nate is predicting stress sleep. Claire?
Will we know anything? Sure. Yeah.
Will we know everything?
Will we be able to say this was effectively
I think I'm going to die not knowing everything.
Yeah, okay, good. On that is a
comfortable
perfect
with
note to end on. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to you, Nate Silver.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, Claire Malone.
Thanks.
And thanks to you, Micah Cohen.
My pleasure.
As I mentioned, this is part one of our two-part election preview for the podcast. Tomorrow morning, we're going to put out a guide to the election night, hour by hour, a little bit more of a kind of viewers, listeners, watchers guide. So be sure to check in for that. And then, of course, we will have the live blog and all sorts of other stuff. And then we're also planning to do late-night election podcast reaction and then day after podcast reaction. So we will have you covered. My name is Jody Avirgan. Galen Druk is our producer, and Galen Druk also has a birthday today. Happy birthday, Galen.
Yay,
Please
Galen.
Tony Chow is in the control room sitting next to the birthday boy. You can get in touch by emailing us at podcasts@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with any questions or comments. But actually, the best way to engage with the site at this point, join us on the live blog tomorrow where we will be looking at comments and answering listener questions and so forth. We try and keep it very interactive, right?
Yeah, send questions you want answered on the live blog to @538politics.
All right, there you go. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.